Hello people, hope you've been enjoying some of the recent podcasts and YouTube videos that I've been generating for Woodbury House. I'm currently sat here today. I've been asked by a couple of members at Woodbury House to do another bit of content on the art market and just our take on how to approach the art market. I know there are plenty of people now, after watching our last video about the looming recession, about the COVID-19 situation, about the uncertainty with economies, governments, banks, the stock market and a lot of conventional areas. They're looking to get involved with art, and specifically Richard Hambleton artworks. So I thought I would title and do a podcast on the guide to buying art. I've done roughly about 5 different points. This is some basic stuff that we've picked up and learned along our journey. And I want you to take a note of these, and then more importantly, do your own research. And then I think you will find that some of the points I'm about to share with you is quite common knowledge in the art market, and more importantly, very, very helpful. And it makes things a little bit easier when parting with some money when purchasing art. My first question I always ask a potential client, investor, collector, art lover is, are you buying art for the sheer love of it and to decorate your home or maybe your office or one of your properties? Or are you buying art to invest into it to make some kind of return, or just to shield your money? Or is it a bit of both? We typically get a lot of people buying Hambleton works because they've owned the likes of Jean-Michel Basquiat, they've owned the likes of Keith Haring, they've owned the likes of Ramosi or Banksy or any of the street art legends, and they want to complement their portfolio by owning Hambleton. They buy because they're collectors and they feel that it's going to align with some of the other artists that they've purchased, but also they like the look of it and they want to put it in their office. Like I mentioned, this particular piece behind me, this landscape that we've just acquired for one of our top clients and investors, has bought this, yes, to make money, and he wants to have a sound investment, but he's going to put it in his new penthouse flat that he's acquired in North London somewhere. So I would say he sits in between. So if you are buying as an investor, my, let's say, old mentor who got me involved with the art market, someone who's a very credible individual when it comes down to art, someone who's been in the art market for some time, he said to me, there's a difference between good art and investment grade art. And here's the difference. You need to ask yourself 3 main questions. Number 1, is the artist backed by a recognized gallery? Number 2, is the artist backed by a recognized art dealer, art family, art collector? And number 3, is the artist backed by a recognized museum? Now let's specifically look at Richard Hambleton. For many years he had the answer to 2 of them. He was backed by a recognised gallery. There's plenty of galleries around the world. In the documentary, the Shadow Man documentary, there is a gallery reference in there called the Woodwards. Christine Woodward owns that gallery with her husband, and they're definitely a credible gallery. And there's plenty of other, art agencies, galleries, organisations that have represented Hambleton, including Woodbury House. The second point is an art dealer. There's plenty of big art dealers, collectors out there that have stockpiled Richard Hambleton's work. And if you were to jump on the internet, you would find plenty of these credible people. The last one he didn't have up until recently, in recent years, which is a credible art museum, a recognised art museum. Sadly, before, and the irony is just before he passed away, he was admitted into the MoMA, which stands for the Museum of Modern Art. The Museum of Modern Art, just to give some kind of reference or comparison, I say to a lot of investors who've bought into banking investments or into stocks, it's a little bit like you may see the Museum of Modern Art as almost like a central bank. You go to a central bank, they set the tone, they set the interest rates, and in a roundabout way, many say that the Museum of Modern Art, the MoMA, is exactly like that. And when they put Richard Hambleton or any of their artists into their permanent collection, what they're saying to the wider world, to the art market, is we don't just see Richard Hambleton or the other artists that we've put into our permanent collection as a credible artist, but they're so significant to art history that many of the other greats that we have seen today, such as, you know, the Banksys, maybe Kaws, maybe Damien Hirst, maybe Jeff Koons, maybe some of these other artists that are not all necessarily in street art, but he's set a tone and blazed his own trail that many of the other artists wouldn't be as credible as they are today, or had the same amount of influence if it wasn't for someone like Richard Hambleton. There is this ongoing banter about Banksy that it's been referenced in the Hambleton documentary, The Shadow Man, that Banksy owes a small share in royalties to Hambleton because of the amount of influence, motivation, inspiration he gave his work. So if you're buying into art as an investment, maybe ask yourself these three things before someone gives you a sales presentation on it. Is it, number one, backed by a recognised gallery? Is it, number two, backed by a recognised art dealer, art family, art collector? Number three, is it backed by a recognised museum? If you've got the answer to all three, you're probably going to have a very sound investment. That's almost like a blue chip stock. If you've got two, probably strong. One is obviously going to be weaker. And if you've got none, I'm not saying it can't make money, but there's a difference between blue chip and investment grade up to someone who is emerging, and there is a big difference. Emerging, you can make far much more money, because if they suddenly go from almost nothing to something overnight, it appears the uplift could be magnificent. But you have to understand there's going to be risks attached to that, and there's no such thing as a guarantee in anything in life, any investment, any opportunity, including Richard Hambleton artworks or anything that we showcase our clients. So I feel, just closing off on this point, if you can get all three, you've got a solid sound investment, and if you've got at least one or two of them out of the three, you're certainly in good stead, okay? But do your own research. The next point is, watch interviews, watch video content like the one you're watching right now, but then more importantly, watch documentaries made about the art market. One of them that I tend to watch frequently, just to brush up on a few points, and it's a pretty good watch actually, and I've recommended it to our collectors, investors and art lovers, is watch the BBC documentary which they produced, which is called The Banker's Guide to Art. This documentary labours on the point that a lot of bankers, a lot of people that have been involved with banking or maybe hedge funds or typical investments, ISAs, bonds, shares, things of that nature, they are now looking at art as a safe haven, because it's been proven what the BBC have suggested, that even in times of adversity, people fly to commodities, and some of the collectibles is in actual fact art. And in this documentary, the Banker's Guide to Art, produced by the BBC, they reinforce that point. But what I also like about it, it's not biased. I could sit here all day long and talk to you about how great Hambleton is, how great the art market is, and give you loads of facts and figures, engineering a sales presentation to kind of convince you to say this is the best thing since sliced bread. When in actual fact, this BBC documentary actually talks about the ups and also as well as the downs. Again, I can't reinforce the point enough that there is no such thing as a guarantee and as a complete non-risk investment opportunity. It just doesn't exist, including in the art market. But you can mitigate your risk by learning about it, by researching it, by looking at the trends, look at auction results, look at who's backing the market, who's promoting it, what the artist has done. All those kind of things will kind of downsize the risk and kind of minimize it. So learning and watching this documentary by the BBC, The Banker's Guide to Art, certainly gives you a good overview, and there's a lot of pluses in there, there's a lot of exposure to the risk, and after you've watched it, it will give you a bit of a flavour to whether or not that art is something for you and something for you to be buying into or stockpiling or investing into. For me, it's a non-biased documentary, which I feel is a great, helpful educational tool. On the note of documentaries, as far as Hambleton's concerned, I've mentioned that he's got a documentary called The Shadow Man. It's on Amazon. I believe it's also on Apple somewhere, on iTunes. The documentary won an award. It came second in its class at the Tribeca Film Festival. So already there, you've got credibility attached to the Shadow Man documentary, which is going to hold a lot of weight when it comes down to Richard Hamilton's art market. But then also look at his predecessors. There's a fantastic documentary by or about Jean-Michel Basquiat, who was a painting partner almost to Richard Hamilton. They were very good friends. And if you've read the Richard Hamilton brochure, or even done any kind of research into the publications made of Jean-Michel Basquiat, Keith Haring, and Richard Hamilton, it says in there that Richard Hamilton and Jean-Michel Basquiat used to trade their art, and Basquiat would usually, which is quite common, trade 3 to 4 pieces of his original artwork for one Richard Hamilton artwork. What does that say about Richard Hamilton? It shows that even Jean-Michel Basquiat, where, bearing in mind, one of his pieces in 2017, Under the Hammer, in an auction went for $110.5 million to a billionaire, it shows that Jean-Michel Basquiat saw Hamilton a lot more valuable and a lot more recognized than his own artworks. And I think that also happened with multiple different street art artists. So Jean-Michel Basquiat has got a documentary called The Radiant Child. I think you can find this on YouTube. You can find it on pretty much a lot of the video platforms. It's a fantastic watch. And it also shows the relationships between Jean-Michel Basquiat with many other artists, including the legend Andy Warhol. Now, on that note, my mentor also said to me that try and buy artists that have created the genre and blazed a trail into their style. So let me describe that. If you're looking way back, there was a big movement called modern art. One of the main people to start modern art was Picasso. Now, if you and I bought a Picasso many years ago, let's say we had the power to turn back the hands of time, and I had a magic watch to spin us back many, many years, if you were to sell that painting today by Picasso, we would be far wealthier than we are today. That supports that art as an investment, okay? The movement after modern art, which was thriving for many years, and it's still thriving still today, was in pop art. There was a few different key artists that started that movement, but the main one that most people reference pop art to is Andy Warhol. Again, if we had the powers to turn back the hands of time and use hindsight to our advantage, chances are we wouldn't be watching this documentary right now. We might be somewhere sunning ourselves on a yacht, or somewhere phenomenal, because we're enjoying the wealth of the great decisions we made a few years ago because we purchased an Andy Warhol original, okay? Now, what is the biggest movement happening today? Without question, if you look at any auction houses, Bonhams, Phillips, Christie's, Sotheby's, and multiple others, many of the massive auction results which are happening today is around the street art movement. Banksy is one of them, but of course, there are other artists out there which are having record-breaking results. Days, Ramosi, Crash, Futura, Retna, and of course Richard Hamilton, Jean-Michel Basquiat, and Keith Haring. So if you start watching documentaries, watch the likes of The Radiant Child, because that shows a little bit of the history of street art. And they do say to predict the future, you need to look at the past. The future is a mirror reflection of the past. So The Radiant Child, Jean-Michel Basquiat documentary, is a great insight to that, and it shows you the affiliation that and the partnership that Jean-Michel Basquiat had with Andy Warhol. They used to do collaboration paintings together. That was a really interesting insight that I learned when I watched it. And as we well know, we know that Jean-Michel Basquiat had a link to Richard Hamilton. There's clear evidence of that. The last final one I want to share with you is Banksy's one, which is called Exit Through a Gift Shop. Now, this almost demonstrates that there are no rules in street art. You can kind of borrow, replicate, copy, get influence, allude to certain other styles. And this documentary is kind of a documentary of Banksy, but as well as another artist called Brainwash. But what I'm trying to get at is many of the street artists, used to borrow each other's works, or even draw influence from the way they used to paint. And I think by learning and watching certain documentaries like these ones, Banksy's one, Jean-Michel Basquiat's one, it starts to mould and shape your own taste buds. So some people are bought into Hambleton Works because they know they're going to make money, or they believe they're going to make money over 5 or 10 years. But as they start to watch the Shadow Man documentary, Radiant Child, and also the Banksy's documentary, it starts to shape their taste, and they actually start acquiring it because they appreciate the works a lot more. When I first looked at it, I wasn't too sure if I loved it. And as I grew to understand the art market, and also to become a fan of Richard Hambleton's and watch his documentary time and time again, it definitely shaped my taste buds. The next point, again, I'm not a financial advisor, I'm not an accountant, I'm not here to give you tax or financial advice, but many of the financial advisors out there say to diversify, and to a certain degree, I would support that in art to a certain level. There's a author and a property tycoon, a guy called Robert Kiyosaki, who wrote the legendary book called Rich Dad Poor Dad. There's 1 and 2 and there's multiple different books. I've read that countless times. And he says, yes, you should diversify, but be careful not to diversify. So just because you're going into other areas doesn't mean you're suddenly spreading your risk and you're going to make a lot more money. Sometimes you can diversify but into the wrong areas, and you're actually going to lose money. I personally would not try and scattergun and become an expert, or trying to purport to be an expert in multiple different genres. I would certainly pigeonhole and become an expert in one, because I believe that if you understand a genre inside and out, a certain few artists inside and out, that's far better than having 20, 30 different artists that 10 or 20% on, and you're trying to purport that you're an expert in an area where sadly you're not. For us, when we got into the art market, we're not art experts, and that's one thing I always say to my collectors and investors. But as far as Hambleton's concerned, and many other artists in the street art sector, we've learnt it because we've lived it, we've breathed it, we slept it. We're doing it day to day, and that is our kind of bread and butter, as it were. Diversifying is key to a certain level, but I would pigeonhole into a genre, something like street art, and then start to study some of the credible artists that have blazed their trail and who have started that movement, okay? So diversifying from Richard Hambleton, if you started with Richard Hambleton, Days is a good one, Crash is another, Futura, Retina. Like I mentioned in previous podcasts, we've done a big show with Days last year in 2019. He'd done 2 murals for us. I think this was the first time, he's only ever done a few shows in London. We currently have some of his works, and the good thing about Days, he knew Jean-Michel Basquiat, he knew Keith Haring, he knew Richard Hambleton. In actual fact, he was Richard Hambleton's tenant for a long time. So the connection is there, and I think that's important. If you're collecting works, have a connection somewhere down the line with the other artists that you are looking to acquire. This brings me on to the next point. If you buy an artist, diversify their style. So, for example, Richard Hambleton is known for his shadow figures, standing shadow man, lurking shadow man, which he got inspiration from the crime back in New York. Drugs, prostitution, gangs, violence, shootings, robberies, muggings, that kind of stuff. And these lurking shadow figures, as it says in the film, and as it says by many of the credible people in the film, that it resembles the eeriness and the controversial situations that were happening in New York at that time, and many other places around the world, but definitely New York. So the Shadow Men is kind of what he's known for, and many of the big auction results have come from his shadow figures. There are landscapes, there are seascapes, there are shadow cats, love hearts, rodeos. Behind me here, we've just acquired this landscape piece for a very good client of ours. Like I mentioned, it's going to go into his penthouse. He asked us to build a portfolio for him, which happens regularly. He wanted a very strong, great example of a standing shadow man, preferably from the 80s, because the 80s is kind of where he made his mark, and many collectors, investors are saying these are the ones that are going to reach the massive heights. So we're looking for that. Find him a good quality landscape which has been featured in some credible shows. This one behind me, I believe, has been featured in the Giorgio Armani show that was put on a few years back. There were 5 shows around the world, and I believe this one was featured in there. Also, the rodeo that we acquired for him was like a forward-facing rodeo. That was also in one of the shows. The point is, he's going for different styles, different images that Richard Hamilton made, and I think that's quite good advice. If you're going to buy artists, maybe try and get different styles and different variations of their work to build a solid portfolio and something that you can really enjoy. Right, number 4, acquiring COAs. COA stands for Certificate of Authenticity. Now, not all art, believe this or not, comes with a COA. Not all COAs are worth the paper they're written on, okay? If a gallery suddenly starts up tomorrow, because anyone can start up an art agency, an art gallery, an art organisation, and they provide you with a COA, I'm not saying it's not credible, but I'm just saying, you know, ask questions about how credible it is. Make sure that you're either getting it from the artist themselves directly, if they're sadly passed away or not coherent or unable to provide a certificate, then get it from the estate, get it from the copyright, or get it from the archive, the corporate entity that owns the actual rights to the Hamilton artworks that can actually support that these are genuine artworks by the artists. The last point is get it from credible galleries. There are some galleries which are here today, gone tomorrow, but there are credible ones. I'm not here to tell you which ones are credible, which ones are not. Go out there, do your own research, but you will find with the amount of content online, with the amount of shows they've done, with the amount of podcasts, with the amount of knowledge they've got, with the amount of people that they're affiliated to, then it will demonstrate they are most likely experts in that sector, and most likely that they have a little bit of weight when it comes down to saying whether something's a real genuine artwork by that artist or not. So do your own homework on that. Number 5, I believe this is more important than a COA. It's called Providence. Get a letter of Providence. Providence is, from my research, is a French Latin word which basically means the history of that art. It's like a logbook. So if you were to buy a car, you would usually get a logbook. That logbook would tell you who's owned it, the service history, any damages made, any major repairs, that kind of thing. And with art, getting a letter of Providence, in my opinion, if I were to acquire a piece of art tomorrow, I would look and seek for that letter of Providence moreover than a COA in my personal experience. And most of my collectors say the same. I want to know who's owned that piece. I want to know what shows it's been in. So again, if you can buy a piece of art that has been owned by a credible celebrity, a household name, someone's in the public eye, someone that people respect or admire or love, then I think that piece of art usually has a bit of like a premium attached to it. You know, sometimes people might pay 10, 20, 30, 40% over the market value because it's got a premium attached to it because of who's owned it. I know one of the horse and riders that we managed to find for one of our clients was owned by a very credible person in history. I'm not going to share who that is, but it's someone that in history books has been affiliated to a huge family, and therefore that would come with a premium. It's a bit like, I don't know, Steve McQueen. He passed away many years ago, or someone like George Michael or Michael Jackson. If they owned a house, if they owned a car, if they owned a guitar, if they owned a certain art piece, that would for sure bring a bit of kudos and a bit of credibility and a bit of premium to the artwork. One sad story that happened in recent times was David Bowie. He was known for collecting art, street art in particular. He had a lot of his art go to lots of different auction houses, and they were auctioned off for a massive amount of money. 1, because of the artist, 2, because of the genre, 3, because of the auction results, but the last one, because of who he was. He was an absolute magnificent artist in music, and many people adored him, and because of that they wanted a piece of artwork that was owned by originally David Bowie. So look out for that. And the piece behind me again has been featured in the Giorgio Armani show. So look at things that have been featured in shows, been in certain publications. It could be in a Forbes article, it could be in a GQ article, it could be in a Vogue article, it could be in a any of the credible articles out there. We've certainly been featured in many, and we try and get our clients' artwork featured in many of these as possible. I hope that's given you a bit of clarity, a bit of insight. I hope you've been enjoying these podcasts, these YouTube videos that I've been making for Woodbury House. This should give you a bit of confidence to think, you know what, maybe if my ISAs is not performing, if my stocks are not performing, if my other art isn't performing, if my other collectibles is not performing, maybe it might be an opportunity to start researching for yourself and look at the Richard Hamilton market, look at the street art market, and find an area that you're comfortable with. Get in contact with us, send us a DM on social media, email us, give us a phone call, book an appointment down here, give me a contact, and I'll be happy to share a bit more information with you. Definitely watch them documentaries, definitely follow up on some of the stuff I've said. And remember, be happy, never content. Life, we've got one opportunity here. We're in the middle of the COVID so-called crisis, and there are plenty of opportunities out there. In history, even Giorgio Armani has said that in events of pending looming crisis, there is phenomenal opportunity. So look for that opportunity, and this might be just the one for you.